Hi there, how was your day? Oh, don't worry about that, it's just the console wars flaring up again. Sounds to me like Sony making another stupid choice. But it hasn't always been like this. While it might not seem like it now, it wasn't always Xbox versus PlayStation with Nintendo doing their own thing. In fact, there were other names competing beyond the main three, and a time when PlayStation and Xbox didn't even exist. Yes, I come to you bearing news of the consoles of old, and the names long forgotten by this world. If you brave your way through this journey, you will have gained great knowledge on power, bravery, and what the hell an Intellivision is. So join me, if you dare, as we take a dive into the full history, more or less, of the console wars. We begin our journey in the age of Atari. This forgotten joke was once a titan of the industry. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you wanted video games at home, then you went to Atari. Sure, there were other options, but I mean, look at this library. They had some of the biggest names in gaming at the time: Space Invaders, Centipede, and most notably, Pac-Man. Now this is notable for a few reasons, not only because at the time this was the most recognizable character in all of gaming, but also because of what this game helped do to the industry. And by help I mean destroy. The video game crash of 1983, this was a time when people gave up on video games in the home, and it was mostly thanks to Atari. They were pumping out too many games too fast, most of which were flaming piles of garbage like E.T. or the previously mentioned Pac-Man. Consumers lost faith in video games, and Atari lost its throne. And there you have it, dear viewer. The age of Atari. But that's not the end, for we still have much more to discuss, and names you may begin to recognize, especially as we head into the next generation. The Nintendo Age. This was the first time that Nintendo tried their hand in the console market. While they had made many arcade games leading up to this point, they had never launched their own home console. But in 1983, they decided to give it their first shot with the Famicom. The Famicom released exclusively in Japan, and it didn't take long to become the highest selling console within the country. After the success of the system, they decided to bring it over to other territories, most notably the US, where it was rebranded to the now iconic Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. The system then went on to sell over 60 million units. Numbers unheard of by that point in time. This was mainly thanks to the games on offer as NES exclusives: Duck Hunt, Excitebike, Tetris, Super Mario Bros, The Legend of Zelda. This system had games that you just had to play. But Nintendo wasn't the only name present in this generation, as there was one more in the form of Sega. The Sega Master System was the console launched to compete with Nintendo, and how well did it do? It did fine, selling roughly 10 to 13 million units. Weirdly enough, it saw huge success in Europe and Brazil, but it just couldn't get itself off the ground in Japan and America. And although these numbers were good for the time, even then it still couldn't hold a candle to the 60 million units sold by Nintendo, leaving Nintendo and the NES the rightful holder of the throne this generation. And now we journey forth into the next generation, a generation of console war that's gone down in infamy. The Great Battle of Nintendo. This generation had two clashing titans, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the SNES for short. This was really the first ever console war. Up until this point, there was always one top system with a couple of other options that just really needed to go home, but for the first time, there was actual competition. The Genesis and the SNES were constantly at each other's necks. The Genesis positioned itself as a more mature console, which actually landed it in hot legal water a couple of times, but that's a discussion for another day. And Nintendo just kept doing what Nintendo does. This is the generation that gave us the infamous Nintendo Don't ads, where Sega wouldn't stop talking about how pathetic Mario was. But at the end of the day, both of these consoles were great. The Genesis had some of the best sports games on the market, more mature titles, and of course Sonic the Hedgehog, and Nintendo had some of their most beloved classics, but who cares about the actual quality of these systems? Which one sold better? Well, it seems like once the dust settled, Nintendo still came out on top, with the SNES selling just about 50 million units. Although it was a closer call this time, as the Genesis managed to sell about 30 million units. So while the Genesis put up a good fight, even managing to convert some Nintendo fans to their console, Nintendo managed to keep a hold of that throne after all. But that's not all, as before this generation came to a close, Nintendo tried something weird. They planned to partner up with another company to develop a disk drive add-on for the Super Nintendo. This add-on would allow the system to display 3D graphics with the use of discs instead of cartridges. However, this ended up getting scrapped because Nintendo wasn't happy with how much money they'd been making, and the company they partnered up with wasn't happy with that choice. They didn't spend their time and money just to be turned away, and so they decided to make their own new system to rival Nintendo. And who was this company, I hear you asking? Well, you'll soon find out as we move into the next generation. The dawn of the PlayStation. As you probably guessed by now, that company Nintendo had partnered up with was Sony, and they, in the most profitable temper tantrum in history, made the PlayStation. But hey, Nintendo still has a chance. After all, this was the first console Sony made. It couldn't have sold that well. Oh my god. Well, this is interesting. The PlayStation sold 102 million units, leaving Nintendo and Sega crushed with their new systems selling 32 and 9 million respectively. So, what happened here? How did a new name claim such immediate success while Nintendo and Sega, two veterans of the industry, were left out to dry? Well, for the first time ever, we saw the use of discs being the main way to play games on consoles this generation. This was so much more convenient, better storage, sound, graphics, which made it even worse when Nintendo decided to stick with cartridges. Most third parties began developing bigger games to take advantage of the discs, and because of that, most third party games just couldn't work on the N64. And with the PlayStation selling so well and also just being easier and more streamlined to develop, it's not hard to see why so many third parties just flat out abandoned Nintendo, which just made the PlayStation seem even more appealing. But that doesn't mean there were no good games for the N64. You had Super Mario 64, Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time, Super Smash Bros, GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, plenty of good games. But then you compare that to Sony's Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Tomb Raider, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, plus superior versions to games found on the N64, and you have a lineup that's a true contender. And then the Saturn had basically no games. This thing was more difficult to work with than the PlayStation and performed even worse than the N64, leading to developers just not really bothering with this console. So after all that, it's easy to see why PlayStation ended up being the true winner at the end of this generation. And if you think that Sony's tyranny will finally come to an end within the next generation, then you would be sorely mistaken, as we're about to enter the era of the PlayStation 2. Okay, so Sony did well last time, but surely they couldn't do better this time. At the very most, they'll perform on the same level as they did the last gen. Oh my what? At least Nintendo and Sega must have performed better as well. Oh come on! Okay, so what happened? Well, let's start off with Sony. This generation, they put out the PlayStation 2, which sold 155 million units and remains the highest selling system to this day. But why? Well, Sony was still very much riding off with the success of the first PlayStation here, and after Nintendo's numbers had been dropping for a while by this point and Sega was, well, Sega, it makes sense that even more would migrate to this console over the childish-seeming GameCube or the Dreamcast-seeming Dreamcast. And what furthered this was the fact that the PlayStation 2 was the only one of the three consoles that could also play DVDs, and back in the early 2000s, that was huge. DVD players were pricey and so were most consoles, so why not go for the DVD playing console? On top of this, further into the PS2's life, its price was dropped by 100 quid, making it even more appealing. And as far as games go, not only did this beast have a great library of its own, but it was also backwards compatible with the PS1's library, which positioned it not only as a new console and DVD player, but also as a replacement for the then highest selling console ever. So by now it's obvious that the PS2 won the war this generation, but how did the other names hold up? Well, Nintendo released the GameCube, selling just over 20 million units. This little freak is now a beloved cult classic. It's notorious for its crappy selection of games, but it did host a couple of gems. Super Mario Sunshine, Pikmin, Luigi's Mansion, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Wind Waker, good games for sure, but not quite enough to sell a system. And the even worse third-party support just made it seem even worse. The console still didn't use full-on discs, instead it used micro discs, which sure, yes, could store more than a cartridge, but also couldn't store quite as much as regular discs. This again led to the thing being harder to develop for and third parties dropping out yet again. And then you have a Dreamcast, which is quite often referred to as ahead of its time. It had some solid first-party support, but was hugely lacking in the third-party department. Due to Sega already losing numbers and people being more concerned with the PS2, this one was just kinda left behind. And things get more unfortunate as this was Sega's last console. The writing was on the wall here. Sega wasn't gaining enough profit from these consoles to keep them releasing. Their last two consoles couldn't break 20 million sold units combined, and so ultimately, it was time to call it quits. However, we're still not done here, as even with Sega done and out of the picture, there is still one more console to talk about. A newcomer in fact, not only that, but a newcomer in the name of Microsoft. At the time, this was weird. Microsoft was known for Windows, not game consoles, so when they announced their new Xbox, many were skeptical. However, the console was still a decent success, even outselling Nintendo's GameCube at roughly 24 million units sold. For a newcomer, that's not bad, especially when it's a newcomer going up against the PS2. So when all is said and done, Sony made it out on top for the second time. But it was not without sacrifice, as the long-competing Sega fell this generation. However, Xbox took its place, for better or for worse, and Nintendo learned that if they wanted to keep competing, they would have to seriously alter just how they did things. And that they did in this next generation, but I warn you, what you are about to see is not for the faint of heart. This generation is the bearer of much evil. You'd be wise to turn away now, for we are about to enter the Great Casual Pandering. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed so far, Nintendo's numbers have been plummeting for these last few generations. As time went on, it seemed as though people had just begun to lose interest in their consoles, and Nintendo knew that this had to change if they were to continue on in the hardware business, and so they came up with an idea. What if they made a console that appealed to those who didn't play video games? A console so simple that anyone could instantly understand it. Well, from that idea came the Wii, and from the Wii came profits. This dainty little thing ended up selling 101 million units, nearly outselling Sony there. The Wii used simple hardware, motion controls, and ultimately set Nintendo's hardware back a generation. Whether or not this console was actually good for Nintendo though is way too big a discussion to cram into this video, so I'll just give you a brief summary. It really leaned into motion controls and was enough to capture the mind of people who didn't typically play video games or hadn't done for years. People flocked to buy this thing just because of the sheer hype, and if it wasn't for that, who knows if Nintendo would still be making consoles today. However, while the Wii did end up bringing Nintendo back from the dead as far as sales are concerned, overall it did end up working their reputation for a while there. This generation, they really pandered to the more casual players, and while having casual options isn't a bad thing, it was pretty much all they were supplying. Sure, they had some big titles from their core franchises, Smash, Mario, Zelda, but some felt that the core fans were being left with little to nothing. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, when you reveal a vitality sensor add-on for your console, it's easy to see why people might think that you've forgotten your core audience. Overall, the real damage of this pandering wouldn't be seen until the next generation, but we'll focus more on that later. For now, let's check up on Xbox and PlayStation. The Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were the new consoles from both companies this generation, showing that Sony loved consistency and Microsoft failed preschool. And just like Sega and Nintendo in the 90s, these consoles were constantly at war with each other. One second something would happen to give Microsoft the upper hand, and the next second something would happen to give Sony the upper hand, all while the gaming landscape and what people wanted was changing dramatically. To begin with, it was Microsoft that had the upper hand, releasing earlier with the 360 costing only $400, while the PS3 cost $600. Not only that, but while the 360 looked pretty nice and was decently advertised, the PS3 had silky curves and notoriously bad marketing. This definitely gave Microsoft the upper hand to begin with, but over time, that began to change. While to begin with, the 360 was appealing and the PS3 was a total joke, that completely changed in the second half of the console's lives. Xbox stopped really caring about their core games and focused way too much on their infamously terrible attempt at taking down the Wii, the Kinect. This caused fans to lose interest and faith in the 360, meanwhile Sony was still putting out great experiences, improving their hardware and re-earning consumer trust. In the end, it was Sony that won over Microsoft, selling 87 million units, while the 360 only sold 85 million units. It was a close fight, and both consoles still hold up today despite their flaws, although it was Nintendo and the Wii that ended up winning this generation overall. Now we move into a generation of not so long ago, one you probably remember well. The Great Fall of Nintendo. Now, remember earlier when I spoke about the Wii's full negative impact not being fully felt until the next generation? Well, this is that generation. The generation Nintendo put this thing out. It goes by the name of Wii U, and it failed miserably, selling only 13 million units. But why? Well, it's mostly thanks to the god-awful marketing. To put it simply, people didn't know what this thing was. Most people assumed it was some kind of upgrade for the Wii. And with a name like Wii U and a controller like that, it's easy to see why. And even if people did know what this thing was, God forbid, they wouldn't be caught dead buying it. Although it has gained a cult following over the last few years, in all fairness, it isn't necessarily a bad console. It has good games, neat features. Its downfall was definitely thanks to the marketing. It just feels like Nintendo was trying to recapture the magic of the Wii, pandering to casual fans who really didn't care to stick around that long. So what was Sony and Microsoft doing while Nintendo was busy eating sand in the sandpit? Well, they were busy putting out yet another line of solid hardware, although not both were focused on solid software. The PS4 was not only a good console, but a good console with a crap ton of games to boot, and the Xbox One was a good console with, well, it has Forza. This is definitely the biggest problem I and many others have with the Xbox One. It's by no means a bad console, but as far as games go, this has basically nothing, which is made even worse when PlayStation has God of War, Spider-Man, and Until Dawn is a personal favourite of mine. The Xbox One just couldn't compete with the PS4's library, although it is worth mentioning that they did get the Game Pass later down the line, but by that point, it was too late. It's also worth mentioning that the announcement of the Xbox One was a dud on its own. They revealed that you couldn't play used games, had to have the Kinect constantly hooked up, and you needed a Wi-Fi connection at all times, which made people give up there and then. You could say that the jury's still out on this one because these consoles are still being actively sold, but come on. Any hopes of Microsoft saving the Xbox One were lost a while ago when the Xbox Series X came out, leaving the Xbox One in the solid state it's in now indefinitely. So the PS4 won this round, and it's worth mentioning that talking about the current generation, aka the Switch versus the PS5 versus the Xbox Series X, will be pretty much impossible given that we're like a quarter into this generation. But I will talk about the Switch given that that's been out for significantly longer. The Switch is Nintendo's much needed return to form. This is a hybrid of a handheld and an at-home console which is its own selling point completely by itself, and on top of that we have some of the best Nintendo games in a while, giving us a healthy balance of core titles and casual games. I love this stinky little thing, and by the looks of things I'm not the only one. The Switch has put Nintendo on top so far this generation, selling 111 million units, with the PS5 only selling 20 million units and the Xbox Series X only selling 14 million units. Sure, we are early into these consoles' lives, but that is still a sorry number compared to anything else these companies have put out before. Again, I would go more into this, but as I feel that could be a video of its own and this generation is still ongoing, I think I'll save that discussion for another time, meaning that we are finally done. Well done, brave viewer, you managed to brave your way to the end, and now you can get back to whatever important matter you have to attend to. As for me, well, I am going to take a friggin' nap. This video is way too long. Jesus Christ!